Hey everyone, welcome back to Harp and Guitar, People and Music, and thank you very much for joining me here once again today for another episode of Whiskey's Blues Gumbo. You know what we do here? This is the show where we take weird or crazy sounding blues words or phrases. We try to figure out what the heck they're talking about. And today I wanted to talk about the word or the term delta. Now, we hear this all the time, right? Mississippi Delta Blues, the Delta Blues. Uh, Robert Johnson is referred to as the king of the Delta Blues singers. But what is the Delta? What are they talking about when they use the term the Delta? And you still hear this term, by the way, all the time, even in modern blues. Well, basically, the Mississippi Delta is kind of often sort of thought of or referred to as being the birthplace of the blues. But the Delta is basically a geographic area in Mississippi. It's sort of a 200-mile triangular shaped area of rich black soil that it used to be flooded each spring by the Mississippi River. Now, eventually, now, and by the way, this land's completely flat from Memphis, Tennessee to Vicksburg, Mississippi. So, and then it's sort of bordered by the Tallahatchie River and the Yazoo Rivers to the east, and then the Mississippi River to the west. So that entire sort of area is a floodplain because it's very flat. And of course, the Mississippi River being a huge river that dumps into the Gulf of Mexico, it would flood every spring. Now, eventually, as agriculture was expanding in the sort of early 1800s, uh, plantations and landowners were looking for more land to develop for their, uh, most specifically, their cotton crops, but also tobacco, sugar cane, corn farms. And that's where you got all of these plantations started popping up in and around roughly the 1830s. And that's when a lot of landowners were buying up this sort of swamp land that had these sort of meandering bayous and wetlands running through it. And they started the really long, difficult process of clearing out the forests in there, draining all of those swamps, and then eventually erecting a levee system to hold back those Mississippi floodwaters every spring. Now, this took decades and decades, and this is where you get a lot of the musical content that was coming out in the very early blues recordings, sort of those first two generations of blues recordings, the 1920s and then again in the 1930s, right up until roughly the pre-war era. So you had guys like Charlie Patton and Son House singing about not only the Delta region, but also the levee system, how the levee system was built. Sunhouse worked on building the levee system. Charlie Patton lived on Dockery's plantation, which eventually ended up in that Mississippi Delta area, in that triangular area. And it was a long, arduous, very, very tough, very labor-intensive um, project to do this. Slave labor was used, and eventually, after the freeing of the slaves, then cheap labor was used. So sharecroppers and farmers were used. Conscripted manual labor was used, and prisoners were used too. And unfortunately, that's where you get a lot of shady dealings in, again, the late 1890s up until about the early 1920s, mid 1920s, where African American men, especially, were lured into participating in illegal acts like illegal crap games or moonshining or bootlegging or something like that. Um, they would be lured in on purpose so that they could be arrested and then forced to work in the levee system or in the lumber camps that were removing the trees from this delta area or draining the swamps and that sort of thing. And there's a lot of songs about that as well. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of songs that make reference to a character by the name of Joe Turner. Not to be confused with Big Joe Turner, the singer, but there was a fictional character known as Joe Turner, And he was, as the story and the songs go, Joe Turner was an African American man who worked sort of for these governing bodies, the prison systems, the work camp systems, and he was one that would lure men into illegal crap games. Then he'd blow the whistle on them so they could be arrested and conscripted into working into these labor camps to build the levees and so forth. Now, as I mentioned earlier, prior to all of this work being done in the Delta area, it was just a forested, swampy area. So there wasn't much in terms of plantations and agriculture going on in there. Anyhow, there were a few cattle farms and a few smaller farms, but not any of the really huge plantations, the cotton plantations and the sugarcane farms. But after all of this work was done with the levee system, draining the swamps, cutting down all of the forested areas, these same workers, whether they were prison workers or paid hired hands, whatever the case may be, a lot of these men stayed in the area after all of this work was done to help build the plantations, first of all, and then later on to live and work on these very same plantations as sharecroppers. For example, as I mentioned, the Dockery's plantation, probably one of the largest and most famous plantations, the Dockery's, Will Dockery and Sons plantation. This is where Charlie Patton's home was. He lived and worked for a time on that plantation. And a lot of these really large plantations, especially the cotton ones, actually had their own town uh, built right on the property or right on the plantation itself. So you would have the sharecroppers' homes built on the land. There would be a company store, like for example, Will Dockery's and Sons Company, the plantation owners, had their own store. There was often churches and schools, community centers, everything that a town would need, a blacksmith, all of that was built on the plantation. And each plantation, again, most especially the really large ones, were pretty much self-sufficient. Anything that was produced, whether it was cotton or tobacco or sugar cane, would be sold in the markets, most often in New Orleans, Louisiana, and then shipped up and down the Mississippi River. Um, and the money that was brought in was put back into the plantation to pay the workers, to reinvest into the plantation, and to build some of these other buildings that made up these plantation communities. So there you go. That's it. The Delta, the Mississippi Delta, sort of this big triangular sort of landmass right at the sort of southern end of the state of Mississippi, as it sort of feeds into the Gulf of Mexico, and then obviously, as mentioned earlier in the beginning, every spring, basically the Mississippi uh, water flow or direction of the flow or the current would be reversed, and it would sort of back up as the delta, the flat swampy area, would be flooded every spring. So I want to thank you very much for tuning in and joining me here once again. As always, muchly appreciated. And as per usual, if you ever come across any strange or weird or crazy sounding blues words or phrases, don't hesitate, drop us a line, let us know. Definitely look into it for you. Be more than happy to do a video describing and defining the whole thing. And of course, once again, as always, on behalf of myself and my partner in crime here at Harp and Guitar, Mr. Monk Music, I want to thank you for all of your support. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, let us know what you think down in the comments, and we'll talk to all of you again real soon. All right, have a great day, and take care of yourselves up there. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.